Well, hello everybody. The other night I had the opportunity to go on a date with somebody, and I thought things were going very well. We had a good conversation. There was certainly a level of physical attraction, at least that was explicitly stated, which doesn't always mean that it's true. And at the very end of the talk, we were out eating someplace, so everything was G-rated. The guy I was with, and this was the first time that I had met, said, "Listen, don't take this wrong. You're really attractive, but guns are a huge turnoff." Now, I had mentioned that I was a gun owner earlier in the conversation. There had been no political debate or of anything. It's just something that it had come up as a necessary component in a narrative I was spinning. And he basically proceeded to then tell me that guns were murderous weapons, that it was terrible, that nobody should be allowed to own more than two. Of course, that there should be background checks and all number of other things, and that it was absolutely absurd that anyone would own more than two. And I don't go on dates to get on in political discussions, but if people are going to, advocate, and I can understand, like at a personal level, if you don't like people with guns or you think guns are scary, and a lot of people do, especially people who have never handled them or touched them. Even people who are ideologically in favor of gun rights often get nervous around guns. Jeffrey Tucker famously quoted that he thinks guns are terrifying, and he's glad that other people like to carry them because there's a positive externality that they reduce crime, and then he doesn't have to worry about it. I know the first time, and I did not touch a firearm until I was in my mid-20s, and there's a certain degree of trepidation, unless you've been kind of brought up around them the first couple times. And everybody that I've shown them to, and it's been more than a few people at this point, they literally tremble. And that's fine. And if somebody at a personal level, you can't really object. Maybe it's irrational, maybe it's silly, but you can't really object if somebody says they frighten me and that's grounds for me to not want to engage with you any further. I can't fault anybody for feeling that. But I can fault for somebody for then going on to say, since you should be criminalized now for owning more than you do or more than I think that you should. And what was interesting is in the debates, I brought up how statistically unlikely any of my guns are to kill anyone, that it's far more likely that my vehicle is going to kill someone, that alcohol is more likely to kill, alcohol is going to kill more people, cigarettes are going to kill more people, your doctor is more likely to kill you than a particular gun is. Not that the number of people accidentally killed by their doctors is actually greater than the number of people who are killed by firearms, I believe. The number that's floating in my head and may be incorrect is something around 60,000, which would be, more than double at least the total deaths by homicides, including all the suicides. And, I pointed out the very obvious fact that if guns actually increased crime, then crime should be worse now than it was 20 years ago, because the number of guns in the United States has increased about 100 million, but the crime rate, especially violent crime, has gone down about 40 to 50%. Facts that this guy readily admitted to. He did not deny that crime was going down. He did not deny the number of guns were going up, although he didn't really have good estimates of how many. And as I kept probing him, it was clear he didn't have a single shred of evidence at all, not even persuasive, let alone proof, a single shred of evidence to support his advocacy of a two-gun limit. That was kind of his big thing, that nobody, quote, needs more than two. And it is absolutely typical of liberals that they would take their personal preference, one that they cannot show how it's anything other than an arbitrary subjective whim, and then normalize that to something that everybody is bound by law to obey. That, and I asked them, have you ever fired a gun? No. Have you ever touched a gun? No. Are you familiar with the different types? There's at minimum three, and that's being overly general, three major types of firearms, modern firearms. You have your handguns, your shotguns, and your rifles. And even there, you have revolvers, you have antique weapons, you have muzzle loaders, you have semi-automatic, you have bolt action. And to come up with a number two is completely arbitrary, and he had no defense, no argument that he could bring forth, not even one, just his personal feeling. And it's so ironic when you have a group of people who crow all day about how bigotry is bad, and how having biases against people is bad, and how open-minded they are, and how inclusive and how multicultural, and how and dude, if we're going to talk about culture, then gun rights in America is part of American culture, no question about it. You can lament that fact as much as you want, it's true. But you have all this flowery rhetoric about inclusion and tolerance, and then the rejection and the mockery of those who generalize or stereotype, or are intolerant to those who have different opinions. And then you juxtapose this with this attitude of, this is my personal preference that I have no evidence is correct, that I can't defend, and I believe everybody should be bound to conform to that preference, period. And no argument is necessary on my part, and any argument against my position, that's a mark against the person arguing against me. That's the attitude, and it's very, very illustrative when it comes to something like guns. And this is assuming that the liberal has an anti-gun attitude, which is not universally true. There are lots of liberals who don't have anti-gun attitudes. A real famous one, if you want to look at speeches, is Don Cates. There's a lot of civil rights workers who are pro-gun. So this is not to say all liberals are like this when it comes to guns, although many of them are. But many liberals are like this when it comes to all kinds of other things, about regulation, about the FDA, about education, about taxes, about anything that they think the government should do. Then that is an example of them taking whatever their personal preferences are and then granting them some deontological weight against everybody. And it was also interesting because I really felt like all of a sudden the burden of proof was on me, even though there was no evidence that I had done anything wrong, that I was a criminal. He certainly didn't assert that I was. He just asserted that my guns were likely to kill somebody, or that they could, which of course is true. Guns can kill people, as can any number of other items. They're inanimate objects. Describing them, moral status like that is really dubious. There's no correlation showing that my owning them makes me more likely to become a criminal, or that owning more than one makes it even more likely. In fact, the more guns you own, it actually kind of implies a certain degree of wealth, which implies that you're less likely to be engaged in violent crimes like homicide. If you have enough money to own 30 guns legitimately, legally, it's not impossible, but it's rather unlikely that you're going to be a crack dealer. I mean, you could make the argument, well, the high-end drug cartels, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of guns. But that's the tiny, tiny sliver of the industry. Your average drug trafficker is not going to have that many. It has no need for that many, by the way. It doesn't take 20 guns. It only takes one. And that's the other interesting thing, is that the prohibition that he's talking about, as with all gun control measures, they make no sense when it comes to some attempt to reduce crime. If you can only own 2 guns, it only takes 1 gun to be an effective, assailant. And the most common type of gun used in crime by far, and I believe it's over 80%, are handguns, the low-end, cheap handguns. And so that's the only kind of gun control that even nominally makes sense. And when we talk about things like assault weapons and .50 calibers and silencers, or large magazines, it becomes very hard to see how that is actually have anything to do with crime. Or crazy people. His other concern was, what if somebody's crazy? And it's like, you can't prohibit somebody on the assumption that they're don't have the right in the first place. But even so, crazy people going on rampages, ironically, always in areas where guns are banned, is of not infinitesimal, it's extremely small part. It's a statistically insignificant part of the homicide. Most of the homicide is not large shootings. It's 1 or 2 victims, usually just 1. And the most pertinent, variable, the highest correlating thing to talk about there is the drug war. And I think anyone who is seriously talking about legislative ways to address gun violence in the United States is to talk about abolishing prohibition in the drug war. And any kind of talk of criminalizing certain types of firearms, especially ones that are almost never used, like assault weapons, so-called, is extremely disingenuous and indicates that the primary motivation is not gun violence or gun deaths or homicide, but some kind of incremental attempt to ban guns generally. And I don't think your average liberal is thinking in those terms. I think that they're getting their talking points from liberal think tanks who are thinking in those terms. And since everything they know about the topic is what Rachel Maddow tells them, or the Brady campaign, or some liberal politician like Chuck Schumer, or Hillary Clinton, or Dianne Feinstein, and not because they've gone and know anything about firearms or anything about criminology or anything about anything for that matter. They have an opinion that they have received from their hours of watching MSNBC, and that's the only thought that comes in their head, even though any look would require addressing the drug war. And if you're going to talk about types, it would be handguns. It would not be about the other types of weapons, even though they're much more powerful. You know, a rifle or a shotgun, vastly more powerful. I mean, you can find the 50 caliber revolver and the 22 caliber rifle, but these are things that the legions of pro-gun control people are unaware of. And this is a very interesting phenomenon where the main characteristic of the pro-gun control people at the grassroots level, this isn't necessarily true of the people in the think tanks, is that they are abhorrently ignorant about firearms in general and the laws, of course the Second Amendment, and yet they have very, very strong opinions about it. Now, gun rights people tend to be gun owners, which means they have at least one level above ignorance that the others don't. Now, this is not to assert that by owning a gun you are suddenly Boston Tea Party and you're an expert and you know all about it. Absolutely not. I wouldn't assert that in the least. But you know more than you would know if you had never touched one and never fired one, never cleaned one, never taken one out to the range, never gone with your friends, never talked about it, never had a conversation that wasn't led. You know, a liberal conversation about guns isn't a conversation. It's listening to a talking head on TV tell them about how they need to ban assault weapons and how they have to close the quote-unquote gun show loophole. But it is interesting to me how adamant they can be on a subject that they know so little about, and then do insist that their attitudes, however ignorant they may be forced onto everybody. And how ironic that is for people who would otherwise be spouting how great champions of the little guy and the minority they are. So, you know, I was always kind of worried that my politics would get in the way of my dating, but actually this is the first time. I would actually characterize most of the guys I met, and look, these are guys now who are mostly coming from Massachusetts, who are coming from Boston, people who are not libertarians, who are liberals if they're anything, and you can see there's a certain degree of trepidation. Most of them have been pretty open to the idea, but this kind of visceral, you know, negative response, backed up by nothing. I mean, I several times I said, well, wait a sec. Okay, so I've put forth my arguments. What are your arguments? What is the basis for you coming to that conclusion? And he could offer none. Not even a bad evidence, not even a straw man, not a fallacy, nothing. Just, that's my opinion, and that's how I feel it should be. And, you know, his earnest, and I also have to wonder, like, if I had told him that I had been in the military, which of course carries the implied potential that you were using firearms to potentially even kill people, I wonder if he would have had such a visceral reaction, or if I had been a police officer, or even if I had explicitly even mentioned that I'd used weapons in combat. I highly doubt that he would have such a similar reaction. So a peaceful, law-abiding citizen owning a gun, that's something to be, or multiple guns in my case, that's something to be suspicious of and wary of and a turn-off, and you know, vaguely criminal and worthy of suspicion. But if I had been a government agent and I had actually used my guns, including recklessly, including in criminal acts against civilians or citizens, or just being negligent about it, that would be okay. That would be not such a bad thing. Now, since we didn't have that discussion, I can't attribute that to him specifically, but I would be very surprised if there weren't plenty of other people out there who that would be an accurate description. And for every one of them, it's an indication of the cognitive dissonance that's going on in their minds and the contradiction within the liberal mindset. And, you know, that is kind of, I think, the source of so many critiques of liberalism, modern liberalism, not classical liberalism, is that on the one hand you have all this rhetoric about inclusion and even to a certain degree decentralization and empowering individuals, which is of course the rhetoric behind like abortion and all of that. That's even the rhetoric behind like voting. But on the other hand, you have this idea that the panacea, or at least the most effective means to reach those ends, is through a massive centralized state. And these are mutually exclusive approaches to society. A massive interventionist state is going to centralize power, it's going to centralize corruption, it's going to centralize force and violence and abuse of power, and not serve the interests of the little guy or the individual or the minority or anything like that. And as we can see, very few liberals, when they're confronted with this, are willing to choose the principles over the means. You know, this is a case where the means are always being preferred over the ends, which indicates that's the true end. And I believe they can talk about civil rights all they want, but unless they're Glenn Greenwald or a very few others who are like him, and there are others, but very few, then it's clear Leviathan is more important than civil rights are, or human rights, or anything along those. Certainly the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is reactionary as far as they're concerned, at least most of them, except for the First Amendment. But even there, you know, the people who are attacking the First Amendment, by and large, are on the left. So, you know, I think just about every criticism I could make of liberals, and there have been many, 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 are going to stem from this incongruency, this contradiction in their ideology. They worship Leviathan. I can understand the reasons why, you know, people think that it's going to be a solution to everything. Now, the only reason you could possibly think that is if you had expended no effort looking at the incentives, no effort looking at the theoretical capabilities and discapabilities of the state, and if you had no empirical knowledge whatsoever, if you had no knowledge of history, because if you have any at all, you have to temper your notions of what the state is capable and capable of doing well. It is capable of doing some things well, like butchery. It's even pretty inefficient about that, actually. But other things, in terms of servicing humans, it has an extremely poor track record. And concluding otherwise requires enormous amount of cherry picking. And this actually also came up in the conversation, because he said, I don't like this because libertarians are against social welfare programs, and I was benefited by a social welfare program. And I said, by that standard, every single social welfare program and every program, whatever, is totally justified, because in everything the government's done, we can find somebody who benefited. And I said, are you for the Iraq War? And he said, of course not. And I said, but millions of people have been benefited by the Iraq War. Not just all the soldiers who have money, but all the people who work at the Raytheon plant building Predator drones. There have been people in Iraq who have been given money, who have been given jobs, who have given subcontracting jobs, who have, you know, who can demonstrably show a balance sheet showing that they're better off. And that doesn't mean that the war is okay, or that the Afghanistan war is okay. And the fact that, you know, the first woman to go on Social Security didn't put a dime in, but received payments for 45 years or something like that, some ridiculously hilarious illustration of the problems involved in the system. You know, that doesn't mean that the system works or is good or is optimal in any sense. And the fact that, you know, you were able to get a check or a stipend or get into a program at a discount or get subsidized in one way or another, that completely ignores the cost. It doesn't even factor in the cost. It's not even mentioned. It's not even considered. There's no evidence that it's even entered the mind of the person making the calculation. Is utterly ridiculous. And once you start trying to make those calculations, and it is difficult, and I have to admit that on many of them you can't come to a dollar calculation. You can come to a calculation based on mutual exchange and conclude that unilateral exchanges that are not mutually beneficial to both parties are on at the very least net socially neutral, whereas ones where both parties agree are socially beneficial. Or you could even argue that if there's coercion involved, they're socially negative. It's difficult to add mathematical terms to value judgments like that, but If you try, it's very hard not to start realizing that the this state, any state, fails to come up as a net benefit in almost any program. There may be a few in the public goods, a few in the free rider problems, a few in the negative externalities that maybe like it's pretty questionable. And when you start considering morality issues and incentive issues, there's no reason to give the state the benefit of the doubt, even in those areas where it's a little bit more hazy. So anyway, this is going to be a shorter video. I see it's 20 minutes, and I think I pretty much finished on this. Also, just as kind of an update, I am returning to work tomorrow, Sunday, February 23rd. I don't know how long this is going to take. I believe it's going to take a long time. Also, as far as I know, I will be working and living on the oil rig site continuously. If you watch my videos for a while, you'll notice that I've uploaded videos from work, but that was always in cases where I was living off of site, say in a city, and commuting every day to the oil rig. And I was only able to upload those videos because I was able to go home, even if I recorded them at work. In the situation where I'm living on the site, not only will I have essentially zero privacy, there probably won't be the correct internet access for me to be able to upload videos. And I have a suspicion that this will take a long time. I'm thinking at least a month. I could be wrong about that, and who knows, I could be uploading a video in a week, but that is my feeling. So if anyone starts to wonder where did I go, that's almost certainly the case. It's not bad. I haven't worked since November. I'm not hurting for money or anything. I made plenty. I have more than a year's of income saved up, essentially, or at least a year of living expenses. But it will be good to get back to work, and it just will mean I won't be able to upload any videos. But hopefully that will allow me to read quite a few books. I still have to do more on China. I'm still doing one on Israel/Zionism. And hopefully I'll be able to read those, and I may be able to record them still and upload them once I get back. I'll try not to front-end load it. I've done that before, where I'll get in from work and I'll upload 6 videos in 2 days, and that's not the way to do it. You need to space it out a little bit, especially if they're longer. But that's what's going on, and I will talk to you all later.